Welcome to Spybrary, the espionage hub for fans of spy history and spy fiction. Today I am thrilled to be joined by Gordon Corera, one of the UK's most respected voices on the world of spies and secrets. Gordon is now the co-host of The Rest is Classified, the brilliant podcast from Goalhanger, exploring the shadowy world of intelligence and spies. Before that, Gordon spent over 20 years as the BBC security correspondent, reporting on everything from cyber warfare to espionage. He's also the author of several acclaimed books, including Russians Among Us, Intercept, and MI6, Life and Death in the British Secret Service. In this episode, we dig into his latest book, The Spy in the Archive, the astonishing true story of Vasili Mitrokhin, a quiet KGB archivist who secretly copied thousands of intelligence files from the KGB archive and eventually defected to the West in one of MI6's most dramatic escape operations. Now, this is a story full of danger, ideology, betrayal, and secrecy, and one that still resonates today. Stay tuned as Gordon shares with us the story behind how he unearthed that amazing footage from the Stasi headquarters in East Berlin, featuring a certain Kim Philby giving a lecture sat next to the man without a face, Marcus Wolf. So settle in, this is an episode you won't want to miss.
Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary podcast is for you. Since 2017, host Shane Whaley and Spybrary field agents around the world dispatch reviews and interviews with authors, historians, and fellow spy fans. We discuss everything from John le Carré, Len Dayton, Paul Viddich, Graham Greene, Mick Herron, Charles Cumming, Ben McIntyre, and many more. Spybrary is available on all good podcast apps and at spybrary.com.
Gordon, welcome to the Spybrary podcast. It's truly an honor to have a conversation with you today.
Well, it is a pleasure to be with you on Spybrary. I've been listening for many years, so it's nice to actually be a guest on it.
Well, that's it's a huge compliment for us because I am a huge admirer of your work. You were always the man on the TV for me who was covering cybersecurity and espionage and intelligence, and we'll dig into that in a moment. But you've written a book, The Spy in the Archive. I'm curious, before we get into that about Mitrokhin, what was it about intelligence, cybersecurity? What was it about espionage that got you so interested in the first place when you became a journalist?
Yeah, never been a spy, because it's often...
They all say that.
Yeah, you always got to say that. But I was actually... I lived in the US and I covered US politics and kind of American issues, and was doing that in the late 90s. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and covering the US meant covering national security. And suddenly I found myself drawn into, covering Afghanistan, Iraq, Al-Qaeda, Guantanamo Bay, all those kind of, that wild period in which national security was at the center of the agenda, and did that and found it fascinating. And was doing that first at the Today programme for the BBC with the big morning show, and then got appointed as a security correspondent, just doing that for all of the BBC in 2004, and did that for a good 20 years, which was, fascinating because national security changes. Every year you're covering something different. One year you're covering Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. The next it's the UK. The next it's Russian espionage. The next it's cybersecurity. And that mix is just amazing and fascinating. And I felt very fortunate to have a kind of front row seat as a journalist to so many of these stories.
Well, I know myself and many of our listeners are jealous or envious of you having that beat, because we can maybe talk about this on a future episode, or you talk about it on the epic Rest is Classified, which is Spybrary approved, fantastic podcast about some of the people you've met in your career and sharing that. So let's talk about Mitrokhin. So what was it about his story that made you think this deserves its own book?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because lots of people are vaguely aware of him. And if you're interested in spies, and, the kind of people who listen to your podcast will be aware of the name, because that famous book came out in 1999, co-authored Mitrokhin and Christopher Andrew, the big, Mitrokhin archive book. And so I was aware of him. But there's a difference between being aware of someone and really knowing their story. And I delved a little bit into the Mitrokhin archive, when I'd been writing my last book, Russians Among Us, which is about Russian illegals in the US. And I'd looked at the kind of history of Russian illegals and looked at the archive. And that started the interest in it. And it was the awareness, well, this is an amazing thing, the Mitrokhin archive. What kind of person would create this? Why and how would someone create such an amazing trove of evidence about the KGB and the Cold War? I was also aware, I have to say, that people had said to me, well, there is a very good story of how he got out, which isn't in the previous book and had never been told before. And whenever someone tells me, oh, there's a really good story there that's never been told before, I think, well, I'll see if I can tell it. So that became really the mission, was to try and talk about this individual, but through the lens of this really exciting story of his escape and the drama of his escape, and the exfiltration by MI6. But I think one more thing I think was also important was, when that book came out in 1999 about Mitrokhin, or by Mitrokhin, I think it got a lot of attention, but I don't think its importance was understood, because I think at that time people thought, Russian spies, the war's long over, we don't need to worry about those. And it actually looks more important, and he looks more important today than I think he did in 1999. I think he looks like a much more significant figure, precisely because he understood Russian intelligence in a way no one else did, because he'd lived it, he'd been part of it, he'd been the archivist for it. And for that reason, what he was saying about Russian intelligence, and he was sounding the alarm bell about it persisting beyond the end of the Cold War, I think was really interesting and important and not understood. So that's a long answer to explain why I thought, well, this is a story worth telling.
And is this the only book that's written about his life story?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a little bit of autobiography in the archive book, but he didn't necessarily want all of the details, I think, out in his lifetime. He was quite private. Quite careful. He didn't leave, that kind of information. And the story of how he got out and his relationship with MI6, MI6 doesn't tell its secrets. so that had not come out before. And that was the bit which, I was kind of really trying to work on to tell to tell the drama of it. But also, I think it gives a great insight into that 90s period of espionage and what was going on then, and how MI6 worked and how the CIA worked and all the other things going on around it at that time, which I find is a kind of really interesting period.
Yeah, I have to say, full confession, and for our listeners, I'm showing a copy of The Sword and the Shield, the Mitrokhin Archive and the Secret History of the KGB that Gordon's referencing. Now, full disclosure, I have not read this cover to cover.
Oh,
I live in the US. As my listeners know, I'm not a gun nut. You should see me on Call of Duty. I can't shoot straight. But I have this near the front door, because if anyone comes in, I'll just throw this door stopper at them. It's a big book.
It's more like a reference book than a page turner, that you're going to read in one sitting.
Absolutely. And I always say especially to budding authors, that these are the books they should be reading, because there's so much you can riff off. Because I've heard you say this in other podcasts that, it's the fact is stranger than fiction. If you were to read some of Mitrokhin's story in a book, in fiction book, you might raise an eyebrow and go, really? How do you expect us to believe that? What do you think your new book adds then to our understanding of Mitrokhin outside of the archive?
So I think it adds lots of things. I think one is who he really was, the man, and why he did it. And I think that is always interesting. To those of us who are kind of fascinated by this world, the issue of motivation is always interesting. And here he is absolutely fascinating when you try and unpick the kind of extent to which it was grievance. This is a man who kind of fails as a first chief directorate officer and is banished to the archives, for having failed. But then, because of what he sees in the archives, is changed by it and is transformed into a secret dissident within the KGB. And then he's a man who has access to files in a way no one else does, and understands the KGB in a way that no one else does. So I think this story of the individual is really interesting, because through it, I think you can tell the story of the KGB and of this thing called Chekhism. Chekhism, the Chekist mindset, Cheka being the original kind of Leninist secret police founded after the revolution. And of course, the Cheka changes names, becomes OGPU, NKVD, KGB, lots of other things, to today the FSB and the SVR. But all of these people refer to themselves as Chekists. So there's a continuity there. And I think you can see the whole story of Chekism from its foundations after the revolution through to today, actually through the eyes of Mitrokhin, because he offers a unique vantage point into it as a former Chekist, as the archivist, as someone who then flees and tries to warn people about the persistence of Chekism. So I think, in a sense, what I found interesting is it's a story about one person, all his kind of complexities, the family situation, the human drama, the exfiltration. But it is also a story about Russia and about particularly the role of Chekism and the intelligence services in Russia and in Russian life from communist days through to today. And I think it's the melding of those two, which I think is particularly interesting about the story.
Yeah. So when he first joined the KGB, I mean, do we know much about that? Why he was recruited, or what skills he offered, or was he a party believer at that time?
Yeah, he was a true believer, and I think that's also what makes him interesting. He's a true believer. He trained a little bit as an archivist during the war, and then he got pulled into being a prosecutor at the end of the war in Ukraine, and he'd seen some dark things there. I mean, he would only say to people, "I saw horrors." And the horrors I think he saw were the suppression of nationalism and dissent by the Soviet Union when it took Ukraine back from the Nazis. And there was violence and there was bloodshed. And I think Mitrokhin was a part of that. He was a small, a cog in that system. But he still joins the KGB when he's offered the chance to go in. And this wonderful world of being an elite first chief directorate officer going abroad, the status that offers, the protection it offers, the glamour it offers. And then the tragedy is he's not very good at it. He's not the kind of person who is a natural on the cocktail party circuit with other diplomats. He doesn't play the games at the Lubyanka either at KGB headquarters. And he's involved in a couple of missions and assignments, which I dig into, one in Israel, one in Australia, which don't go well. And for all of those reasons, this person who was a true believer ends up, having his file stamped with not suitable for operational work, banish him to the archives. And I think, of all the terrible consequential HR personnel decisions that have ever been made by a spy agency, this has to rank up there. Sending Mitrokhin to the archives, is among the worst, because he's going to do terrible damage to the organization when he's banished there because of what he sees. But it's a long, slow journey for him. Banished in 1956 to the archives, only really becomes ideologically disenchanted 1968 with the Prague Spring, and only in 1972 does he actually start this work as a secret dissident in terms of copying the files. So it's a long, slow journey, his own almost spiritual journey, I think, to come to really hate the organization he works for.
And how did he go about robbing all the files and getting them out of there? Maybe you can share that with our listeners.
Yeah, well, this is wild as well, because one of the secrets is that he didn't have to steal anything, because he wasn't taking the original files out, he was copying them. And he, of course, was incredibly fortunate, because he is an archivist. And 1972, the moment of opportunity comes, because the first chief directorate is moving offices. It's moving from the center of Moscow, the Lubyanka, out to the woods, as it's known, the forest, the new headquarters where the SVR is still based. And they've got to move the files. And you need an archivist to oversee that process. So what he's doing in his office, his job is to kind of go through each file effectively and say, keep it, move it, shred it, whatever you need to do with it. And at that point, he's a dissident. So he's just taking tiny notes on a piece of paper. At first, he tries to memorize it, but that's too hard for him. So he's taking tiny notes and then stuffing them in his shoe, folding them up, putting them in his shoe, and then walking out. And of course, he knows the security procedures at Lubyanka and at the forest at Yasnevo. And he knows that they will not, that if you're carrying out a big file or a big suitcase or something like that, they're going to stop you, but they're not going to check your shoe or later on, in your pocket. And so he's able to smuggle out these tiny bits of paper in which he's written in his own shorthand, his own code, the details of the files he thinks are interesting. And then at home in his apartment and on the weekend in his dacha, he can reconstitute these fragments into the original files or copies of the original files, which is just an amazing thing to do in your own little kind of world, taking huge risks and then typing them up and then burying them, in milk churns under the floorboards of his dacha. And it's one of the wild things about it, I think, is it wasn't like he was a spy in the sense of he hadn't been tasked to do this by the CIA or MI6. He had no contact with a foreign intelligence service. He was just doing it. And he was doing it because of this, this idea he had that you had to preserve the truth and that the truth was a weapon that could kill his adversary, the KGB. And his mission was simply to record that truth. And he didn't know how he was going to get it out. He didn't know if he would ever get it out, but he just felt he had to record it. And so, over the years, a copy of the first Chief Directorate's files is being accumulated under the floorboards of a dacha. It's wild, isn't it?
It really is. It is. Was he ever under suspicion?
No. Once or twice he thought he'd been followed. And he got worried and slightly, panicky where he thinks he's being followed. But there's no sign that he was ever under suspicion at any point. I mean, I think, the truth is, other people who talked about him or knew him, people like Gordievsky, now sadly passed, said, people didn't pay attention to archivists. They were kind of clerical rats. They were the person you passed a note to when you needed a file. You didn't really care about them or think about them. And I think his kind of low-key anonymity and his very quiet, introverted personality made him perfectly suited to get away with this kind of slightly madcap plan.
Absolutely. So let's talk then about how he approached the West. Can you walk us through his attempts?
So he retires in 1984 and then he still works on his files and he comes up with lots of kind of slightly crazy plans about thinking how to get his archive out. But it's a big archive. It's not one book. It's not one box. It's multiple boxes. It's not something one person could carry. And he looks at ways maybe he could go out through the east or the west of the Soviet Union. But he's nervous. And he's nervous he'll get caught. The archive will be discovered. He's not your kind of James Bond kind of brave spy in that sense. He is an archivist and he's nervous about his archive. And so it's only when effectively the Soviet Union collapses that he realizes there's an option now because the Baltic states have become independent and Western countries are opening up embassies in the Baltic states. But the border controls to go from Russia to the Baltic states are very lax in the kind of chaotic period of 91, 92. So he realizes he can, go there, try and do it in a low-key way, take a sample of his archive. And of course, he does what most people would do, which is approach the Americans first. and this is a really interesting part of the story, which, I drilled down on and found lots of new details on, which was, he gets turned away multiple times by the CIA or by American embassies. And to be truthful, the Americans I spoke to don't even know how many. I mean, they think it's 3 or 4. At times he's sitting in receptions of embassy being ignored. Another time, someone who is a CIA officer talks to him and thinks he might be interesting, but that CIA officer is about to leave and a new one's coming. The new one comes, takes one look at him and looks at him and goes, "You look like a tramp." And the truth is he did, because he dressed down to not draw attention to himself. And he's also got these files and he's got a sample of them. But as you can tell from the way I explained it, they aren't the original files. They're copies, his write-up of files. So they're also going, there's some guy claiming he's KGB, saying he's got some files, look like he's typed them up himself. So you can see what's happening. And then also at headquarters at Langley, it's very interesting because there's a bit of a battle going on about how to deal with Russia. And, there are... there's the old guard who say we need to continue to run agents, recruit agents, take on every defector because we're, the threat remains. And there's a kind of new view, which is Cold War's over, time to make nice with the Russians. Milt Bearden, a kind of very interesting character, previously had been, running the what had been the Soviet Eastern Division, Eastern Europe Division, and had, said, the bar for taking defectors is now much higher. We're going to work with the Russians through liaison. We'll get things that way. So the CIA is kind of like, they pass on him. I mean, they miss him. And so he goes to the Brits. And there is a history of the Brits picking up from the Americans. You know, this happened a few times over the Cold War and probably after. So he goes to the British Embassy in Vilnius in March 1992, knocks on the door. And it's interesting because he's greeted by a young woman in her 20s who's a British diplomat. And she's not a spy, she's a diplomat. But she speaks Russian and she's been in Moscow. And she immediately, she just senses there's something interesting about him. And so she sits him down, offers him a cup of tea, very British, and has a look at the files and just decides, okay, I think, instinct tells her this is someone worth paying attention to. So after he leaves, suggesting he can come back on another date, she is going to send a message back to MI6 in London saying, might be worth a look. And that's how it starts.
Brilliant. What were Mitrokhin's asks? What were his requests for handing over the archive to the Brits?
Very interesting, because he had two real demands. Money was not one of them. He was not one of those. One was that when it was time, he wanted not just himself, but also all his family to get out. And secondly, and this is also interesting, he wanted the archive to be published. And I think this is, that's not what a normal spy says, is I want, the material I'm getting out to be published. And it goes back to his motivation, the motivation that this is someone who had believed the truth was a weapon, and that he was fighting this adversary, which he visualized, in a kind of semi-spiritual way, as a creature, as a kind of dragon, a three-headed hydra. He actually saw his enemy like that he was fighting this enemy, and he believed that publishing his work would be the means to destroy it and to kill it by exposing the truth about what the KGB had done, not just around the world, but to the Russian people, in his mind, to dissidents and to others. So that's why, publishing it was so important to him.
And you think that would have, I've never worked for the intelligence agencies, I'm not bright enough to do that, but you would think that someone coming and not asking for money in particular and saying, I want my family out and I want this published for the world to see, is as you say, it's very unique. You think the Americans would have been, hang on a minute, this is a little bit different. He doesn't want the house in Florida and everything else and the identity.
$1 million. Yeah, it is different because that was what most people were asking for at that time. And there was a flood of defectors. There were a lot. They were, both the Brits and the Americans were getting a lot of people who were going, I used to be KGB, give me $1 million and a house in Florida, And that was one of the reasons why the bar had got much higher for taking them, because there were just so many at that time. But Mitrokhin was definitely different. He is very different, I think, from a lot of the other spies I've seen and studied. And, that's one of the things that makes him so interesting.
I'd like to chat with you about the exfiltration, and I must pay credit to David McCloskey, who I think now has 4 or 5 careers other than being an analyst and now a podcaster and an author. He's also quite good at reading audiobooks, and he read out the intro to Spy in the Archive. And it's almost like a spy novel in the way that you've written that, which is great. But before we get into that part, what can you tell us about Mitrokhin's family?
Are you on the hunt for your next thrilling spy read? Look no further. Spybrary contributor and Sunday Times chief political commentator Tim Shipman has curated a list of his top 125 spy authors ranked. This list includes both classic and modern writers, making it the ultimate guide for any spy fan. Tim also recommends which book to try first from each author, and he shares his favourite book from each of them too, so you can dive right into the best of the best. Head over to spybrary.com/top125 to grab your free copy now. Don't miss out on the ultimate spy reading list.
Yes, so he's got a wife, Nina, who's actually a very eminent doctor, kind of academic doctor, who he has... it's hard to analyze anyone's relationship. Someone said to me he was the kind of person who was incredibly fond of his wife, but would never tell her so. It was the way it was described. But so I don't think they had a really close relationship. But then they've also got her mother-in-law living with them, and crucially, their son, Vladimir. And the thing about Vladimir is that he is in a wheelchair. He has a muscle wasting disease. And they've been struggling to deal with that since he was born. So by the time of the exfiltration, he's in his 30s. and he's got worse and worse and worse, and they've not been able to treat it. And that is definitely another one of the motivations for Mitrokhin. It's a slight frustration that he's not had the medical treatment he might have liked for his son, and a hope that maybe he can get better medical treatment. So there is a kind of personal motive a bit there. But this is one of the challenges for MI6 when they realize they've got to take him out, is that it's not just taking one man out, it's taking an elderly mother-in-law who is on crutches, effectively, or on a walking stick, a wife, and a son in a wheelchair. And what's more, Mitrokhin only tells his wife just before the exfiltration that they're going to go. I mean, this is the wild, almost kind of darkly comic bit about it, that the mother-in-law and the son don't know they're being exfiltrated when they're being exfiltrated. So MI6 have come up with a cover story that the family are going for medical treatment at a clinic. And this cover story is for, border guards and anyone who asks, but it's also for the members of the family themselves. They think they're going to a medical clinic for treatment and don't realize that actually the journey they're being taken on, is an exfil to get them out of the country. And for that precise reason, and it's one of the kind of pivotal scenes of the book, it nearly goes wrong. I mean, this whole, kind of complicated operation involving, trains, minibuses, which have to be commandeered, and then finally a boat to go across the Baltic, is basically nearly derailed by Mitrokhin's son, who, when he actually, as he is, they're trying to get him on the boat to get out of Lithuania into Sweden, realizes what's actually going on and is in shock. He doesn't, he's leaving behind his friends and his life in Moscow and is resistant to it at that moment. And it leads to a very, very dramatic moment, involving the kind of MI6 team and Vladimir, at the docks of Klaipeda on the Baltic coast.
Excellent. And I do pick up the book and read this because it goes into detail. And also, Gordon kindly recorded 2 episodes of Rest is Classified where you dig more in. We don't have time to do it on this episode, but 2 feature-length podcast episodes on Mitrokhin that I highly recommend folks go and listen to. And then, of course, go buy the book. I'm curious from a research perspective, how challenging was it to research Mitrokhin for the book?
Very.
Yeah.
That's the honest truth. Very,
Yeah.
for a lot of reasons. I mean, so, there's a whole file of his material, but there's actually, if you go to the archives, his archives are now available in Churchill College, Cambridge, but there's nothing biographical in them. There's nothing about him. And he did not want to talk about certain episodes in his career. He did not like talking about why he'd been banished to the archives. He never talked about it to anyone. And I remember going to see, Christopher Andrew and people who'd, worked very closely with him for years and thinking, oh, well, they must know. And they didn't. And so it was piecing together various bits, then also trying to piece together the exfiltration story. And that was, not easy. And it is not, as I say in the book, an authorized account. I did not, go to MI6 and ask them for help or receive any help from them. So it was all pieced together from people who knew him, who'd worked with him over the years. Some of them were very difficult to track down, but equally, I think a lot of people, when I did approach them, I think they recognize his was an important story that, needed to be told. And also, the slight advantage you have is that it's already out. He's not a kind of undeclared agent. He's written a book, but that made it slightly easier, but still, tracking down people and getting those details, I think, was actually one of the hardest challenges I've done as a writer. Definitely.
I can imagine because, when you read spy fiction, you're only limited by your imagination, really. And for you, it's the same with Ben McIntyre, that narrative nonfiction. I admire and marvel at it, how you're able to go and piece together parts of his backstory and really bring it to life. And what was his life like? So he gets to the UK. What happens to him next?
Well, there's lots of interesting bits to this. I mean, one of them, which I think is one of the wilder elements of the operation, is that the Russians don't know he's gone. And I find this extraordinary. But when someone explained it to me, it made a bit of sense, which was, he'd retired. So it's not like he's not turning out for work in the morning, like a kind of Gordievsky, or not been under any suspicion. He lived this kind of slightly hermit's life, And there were 2 dachas for the family and an apartment in Moscow. And people just thought he must be at the other dacha or somewhere else, And the fact the family had gone, that didn't seem to draw that much attention. I think MI6 did come up with some clever ways of making it look like he was somewhere else and still in contact and, doing various things, drawing his pension and the like. So, that allowed that to continue. So for many years, he's a secret. The fact he's out is a secret, and he's living a secret life. Now, there's a period in which, his archive is being worked through MI5, the FBI, others are, getting lots of leads. There's going to be some significant prosecutions, especially in the US, of spies, thanks to Mitrokhin. But of course, he wants his book published. That's his goal. And that's what he'd been promised. And that journey to publication was another thing I kind of reveal for the first time, is just how hard that was. And that it, actually his relationship with MI6, also with Christopher Andrew, pretty much broke down at various points. I mean, he, for lots of reasons, as I said, he wasn't an easy man. I think that was clear to lots of people. He didn't like being edited. He thought his files should be just as they are. So there was a real tension there about the process of publication. At one point, he's talking about, that he doesn't want it to be published in this way, and is kind of angry about it, and is talking about blocking it, and he starts to say, well, I'll get lawyers, the copyright, who owns the copyright, all these kind of things. And someone from MI6 kind of quietly thinks to themselves, if anyone has a claim on copyright, it's probably the KGB. It's their files and their archives, but they're not really in a position to kind of claim copyright on this material. So eventually they do manage to patch it up. And Nina, his wife, plays a role in helping patch it up, as does Robert, one of the kind of people who gets him out. But it's not an easy time. And actually Nina dies she then herself gets a kind of, it's very tragic. She herself gets a kind of motor neurone disease while in Britain in the late 90s, and dies just at the time his book comes out. So, his book comes out in 1999, and it's a moment of kind of turmoil for him. And I think those people who would have seen him at that time wouldn't have understood there's kind of personal turmoil and intellectual turmoil for him. But he still feels his mission is not done. And I think that's the bit that I also found very interesting, is the story doesn't stop with his exfiltration, doesn't stop with the publication of the book, because he's got this, in his mind, the enemy that he's fighting against, he can see it's not dead. And I think this is the, key bit about the book, is it comes out in 1999. And it's a point where people think Cold War, that's history. Russian spies, that's history. There's this new guy, Vladimir Putin, who's just becoming leader of Russia. Yeah, he's ex-KGB, but he's someone we can do business with. Even people in MI6 think that. He's a strong man. He might bring some order to Russia. But Mitrokhin is looking at this. He's looking at Russia and going, hang on, the Chekists are still there. They are back. And now we can see that. But Mitrokhin could see it in the early 2000s. And when I looked at his writings, and this, particularly his writings in a really hard to find book called Chekisms, which is his own book, rather than a co-authored book with anyone else. If you read the footnotes to that, and if you read through it in detail, you can see what he is worried about and what he is warning about, which is that his enemy isn't gone, it isn't defeated, it's just transformed, and the Chekist force is still there and has just taken on a new form in Russia. And so in that way, I just found that really powerful, this idea that he was a man who understood the KGB from having been in the belly of the beast, and who in his final years could see, he could see that it was not gone. But I don't think people were willing to listen, or wanted to listen, or were able to listen.
So when the archive was published, was that the first time it became public that he had defected with his treasure trove? What was the American response?
It's interesting, because in America, the response is, because there's lots of little revelations in the book. some of them, are fascinating, like details about how the State Department had been bugged or which people had been targeted. But they become very obsessed in America. And I watched all the kind of evening news reports, and I think 60 Minutes, or I think it was ABC, did some reports about it as well. And they, inevitably they focus on certain, the more exciting, dramatic bits. Journalists, having been one myself, I know exactly what it's like. You're looking through a book and you're going, what's the news line? What's the top line? What's going to get people in there? And you can see what people are doing. And they end up focusing a lot in America on the claim that the KGB had buried arms caches around the world, including, it's thought, in America. And that they've been these booby-trapped caches of arms ready for, KGB networks to be activated in the event of war and invasion. And they had all these plans for sabotage of, ports and New York and LA and places like that. And that became the focus. And the story then became in the US with the, what's the FBI done about this? Why, have they acted? Have they done enough? Have we found all these caches? And that becomes the story. Just as in Britain, it becomes about a woman called Melita Norwood, who'd been a Soviet spy who was still living as a grandmother. And it was like, has MI5, why is MI5 not prosecuted? Or why is nothing been done about it? And it's so interesting because, and you can see, again, as a journalist myself, what's happened is everyone's focused on that side, those stories, rather than on the story Mitrokhin is trying to tell, which is, look at what the KGB was doing around the world, including to its own people, and was capable of doing. And so again, the kind of narrative gets sidetracked. People are more interested in these things rather than the thing that he wants to talk about.
So for you as a journalist, what do you think was the biggest revelation when you read through the archives and even researched for this book, maybe revisiting it?
In the archives that came out in 1999? Yeah. You see, it's a good question, because I think one of the challenges of it is that there is so much. As you said, you use it as a kind of doorstop stroke weapon. And so on every page, there's a revelation. So it's hard to pick one. And I think that was the problem. And I think that was the problem with it. Whereas if there'd been one single story, it would have been easier to kind of grapple with. But the revelation, in a sense, that it shows is the KGB had infiltrated around the world organizations, institutions, governments, political parties, and was far more energetic than people had understood. And so in a sense, it's rather than it being a single revelation, it's that understanding that Mitrokhin gave us of the KGB, which I think is unique. And in some countries, it became very political. If you take Italy and India, to take two examples, he revealed how many politicians had been agents or on the payroll of the KGB. And of course, this then became political, because then it became, their opponents would say, hey, you're a KGB agent, or, these files say you're a KGB agent. Someone would say, no, that's a plant by someone else. And it's, so it all gets kind of wrapped up in politics. So there were almost so many, it kind of, it's hard to pick one, but in different countries, you saw very different responses to it. Yeah.
Was there anything in there new about Roger Hollis?
Well, the Roger Hollis question.
Yes.
What was I reading recently? I was reading some more. I was reading a book about Spycatcher, which was interesting.
Tim Tate's, was it, To Catch a Spy?
I was reading that, and it kind of took me back to the. So, one of the things, of course, that is interesting is you have, Mitrokhin, and you've also had Gordievsky, who have had access to British archives and have seen no evidence that Hollis is a spy. And that's significant. I mean, now it is worth saying that one of the, people were very interested in the CIA and FBI about Mitrokhin because they were worried about moles. Because of course, there's the famous mole hunt going on in the US in the 90s, which will eventually lead to Aldrich Ames at the agency and Robert Hansen at the Bureau. And people are kind of obsessed with the idea, well, what does Mitrokhin have the answers for these? And he didn't, because he'd retired at the wrong one point, and Hansen had been run by GRU before the KGB. But one of the kind of questions is, could there have been some spies that Mitrokhin didn't know about? And that is possible, because there were, even though he was the archivist of the first chief directorate, one of the theories is some spies could have been handled by the second chief directorate or other directorates, or could have been so sensitive they were kept away even from the archivist. So to Hollis and some of the other questions. It doesn't absolutely prove that he wasn't a spy, but there's certainly no evidence in there that he was.
Right. So if I could put you in the Spybrary time machine, I can sit you down have a cup of tea with Mitrokhin.
Yeah.
What would be the top question? What would be top of mind for you?
I mean, I mean, there's some really detailed questions which I'd want to know, which were, just tell me what went wrong with your career, because I struggled to get to some of the answers on that. And I still think if I had a cup of tea with him, he wouldn't want to tell me. I would love to know what he made of the CIA and MI6. I'd love to know what it's like to be on the other end of it. I've spoken to the people on one end. It'd be nice to talk to the other end. I mean, I know he was pretty angry at the CIA for turning him down at one point. As a kind of shouting match with them. I'd be quite curious about that. You'd want to know. I don't think he's a man who had any regrets about what he did. And I think if you look at him and you look at his final writings and what he was doing, he was a slightly tortured soul. And I think he regretted that he hadn't been listened to and that his work hadn't made more impact. But I think he had no regrets about what he'd done and why he'd done it. And I think I'd like to have just talked to him about that, and understood that from his point of view. And about his relationship with his family, because I think it is fascinating, and to make those decisions and to take those risks and to do it in such a solitary way. I think to try and unpick that character and understand how and why, I think would be really interesting.
And thinking about his son, I mean, what was life like for his son in the UK?
It was okay. I mean, it was so there's this moment of drama, which is, I think, as you say, recounted in the book, where the son, resists going, but then quite quickly comes to terms with it. And I found it also a very moving story, because I think the son for a while is resentful at being taken away from his life in Moscow, from his friends, especially because he's had a difficult life in the wheelchair, but he'd made friends and now he's had to leave them all suddenly with no warning, because of what his father did. So there's bound to be a degree of resentment. But what's interesting is, over time in Britain, that passes. And you see actually quite a close relationship develop with father and son, perhaps even particularly after Nina, the mother and wife, dies. And the son actually takes on the role of trying to preserve the legacy of the father, and he is the one who, after Mitrokhin dies, will kind of try and continue the work to try and get the material published. And he is the one who personally will hand it over to Churchill College, Cambridge, to be deposited. And then he dies, about a decade after his father, so about just over 10 years ago. You see this kind of, I think he late in life came to really appreciate his father, and I find that quite moving as well.
Absolutely. Well, as we wrap up the interview, our listeners have asked me to ask you if you've ever considered writing spy fiction as well as non-fiction.
Couldn't do it. Leave it to McCloskey. I can't make things up. You know what? I mean, I do think some people and colleagues of mine, friends of mine, have made the transition. I've kind of, like everyone, you kind of wonder whether you could do it. And I just thought, I just don't think I can. I think my brain isn't wired in the right way. And I think I'd need to rewire my brain to be able to do fiction. I'm not sure I could do it. I think I have total respect for people who can do it. But I think it is a different discipline from writing nonfiction. But I love writing nonfiction, because I do think, and this story is an example of it, the truth is sometimes wilder than the fiction. It may not have all the car chases and but when you know that this is real, that this guy did these things and took these risks, I find that really speaks to me. So I do love fiction, and I read tons of spy fiction, and I enjoy it enormously. But I kind of like the factual stuff, really.
Absolutely, no, I'm a big fan, and in fact, I have a copy here of MI6: Life and Death in the British Secret Service, Gordon Corera, and I want to personally thank you, because as I've often said, Spybrary started in 2017 when I'd read Le Carré and the Dayton books. And it was also your book that got me back into espionage history, because I was a big reader of it and military history up until my late 20s, and then, work reading and everything else. And you're like 10 years or so ago, this was the book that kind of pulled me back into espionage. So actually, I need to reread it again, because I was flicking through it for this interview. I'm like, this is even better than I remember. I need to go back.
Good.
And read it.
Yeah, I'm really proud of that book. Yeah.
Excellent. What's life like now as a superstar podcaster, Gordon?
Wow.
So you were top man at the BBC for intelligence.
Wow.
And
I can ask you what's life like as a superstar podcaster. It's no, I love it, actually. I mean, I do love it. Doing the podcast, it involves work, because you kind of got to research them and tell the stories, and you want them to be accurate and detailed. So but when I say it's hard work, the hard work involves reading lots of books and talking to people about spies, which I think for both of us kind of counts as a hobby as well as work. So in that way, I love it. I mean, and I'm still do the odd bit of journalism as well, which is nice, because it's nice to kind of keep your hand in it. But we're 6 months into the podcast and I'm loving it. I'm loving telling the stories, and working with David. It's great. So, so far so good. So far the transition has been a lot of fun.
yeah, it's because I've been listening since day one. Because obviously David's a friend of the show, and he's been on Spybrary a few times. Obviously, very intrigued to listen. And I love that you do several episodes. So Mitrokhin, you had 2. You've had some on Snowden and various others. That I really like that, going into detail, because we don't all have time to read doorstopper books. And you give us that flavor, and then it's like, oh, now I want to go and read more about this person because they've given me that curiosity.
I think that's right. And I think, we've just done 6 on Bin Laden. And, some of them are, an hour each. So it's a lot there. But I think what you realize is that's what people want. People want the kind of granular detail, the real texture from people who hopefully have researched it and understand the spy world and can kind of analyze it and pick it apart and know the right details to bring to life. But yeah, I think, what's great about podcasting is there is the appetite there is out. There's an appetite for people who want the detail, who want the stories, who don't want it all in a, 5-minute, piece or a, report or something really kind of truncated, but really want to kind of get into it. And there's a real appetite out there for it, which is great,
You're absolutely spot on, because for most of us, we weren't able to do an MA in security studies or intelligence. That wasn't even around when I was back at school. So, you have to crack the books, and that's great. And we are so lucky in this day and age that we have all these podcasts, we have YouTube, lots of resources to go and teach ourselves, really, but always with that open mind, question everything, because, there's a lot of skullduggery out there as well, isn't there?
There is a bit of bad information there might be. So be careful who you trust.
What's your all-time favorite espionage non-fiction book other than one of yours?
Well, that's a really hard one. You put me on the spot there, and I'm probably gonna pass on it, because I think it's quite hard to pick out a single one that does the trick. And I go through phases of reading kind of, spy memoirs and spy autobiographies and more modern stuff and older stuff. I can't give you one. I'm sorry.
There's a lot out there. There's some great books out there.
But also, you're making me think now. You're making me think, and I feel bad, because there's probably lots of ones I should come up with, or lots of people whose books I've read who want me to come up with one of theirs. But yeah, no, I'm not sure I could pick one. Sorry.
No, that's no problem at all. One thing I would love you and David to cover, I don't know if this is your cup of tea or not on the rest of this class, but I've always been fascinated with the story of Otto Jörn. I'm pronouncing his name.
Yeah. Why? What makes you so interested in that?
Well, that he defected, air quotes, to East Germany, and then later on came back, and he got imprisoned for that. And it was like, he always claimed he was kidnapped and drugged by the Soviets and whisked, because it was obviously before the wall was up, and whisked across to East Berlin. And then he reappeared appeared at this press conference saying he had defected. And I mean, he was head of the domestic intelligence agency for West Germany. He'd been involved in the plots against Hitler. Right. And then he suddenly comes back and says, no, I was kidnapped. It's and like, Nigel West has written stuff on it, and I've read his memoirs. And again, it's like reading My Silent Wall with Philby, right? You need a big bucket of salt with a lot of these books because you can't double check and verify.
Okay. Right. You've given me one to put on the list.
Go on. What are you? Yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
I also suggested the same thing to Ben McIntyre. So, I check in with him to see if he's going to pick that up or not. But I think that's just such a fascinating story that needs to be told.
Yeah. I think, again, because you wonder what pressure was put on him. You wonder what's going on in someone's head, don't you? I mean, that's the thing about these stories, and why I think a lot of spy stories are so interesting is, there's lots of, danger, there's consequence, about, whatever, secrets are being spilled. But what's going on in these people's heads doing these crazy things, whether it's defecting or redefecting, or it's Mitrokhin copying the files, these are not normal people. They're not. And I think intrinsically that makes it interesting, doesn't it? Whether you're talking about fiction or non-fiction, is to try and understand, and get inside what leads people, because they are just people, to do something extraordinary, and with what consequences. So, I think that's a good example of that kind of story.
I mean, and he came back to West Germany and went to prison, so it wasn't like he got, let go, he had to do time for that. So it's like, okay, what really happened then? There must be something in the old Stasi archives or something that's out there that is waiting to be discovered, Gordon.
Yeah, I know. I have a little trip down the Stasi archives. The Stasi archives are amazing. A few years ago, I found for the BBC a video of Kim Philby, which had never been seen before. And it was amazing. But
that came from you when he's next to Marcus Wolf?
Yeah. And
Wow.
and the reason was, it's an interesting story. I got a tip off actually from an American intelligence officer who said, you might want to look for this because we think it exists. And so I then went to the Stasi archives and they found it for me. And so we revealed for the first time this video of Philby giving a lecture to the Stasi, and talking to them, and where he kind of gives his advice, amongst other things, never confess. I found that, thanks to the Stasi archives. So there are secrets in there. There's some great stuff there.
And I'll add a link to that in the show notes, because if you haven't watched that video, it is really worth watching. And the thing with Philby, again, I know we can go on for hours about it, that someone pointed out to me fairly recently, I think it might even been Charlotte Philby, his granddaughter, who told me, was, if you look at that famous I'm Not the Third Man video that he recorded at his mum's flat, he's actually wearing a tie with double crosses on it. Look at that video, Gordon. There are good now. Who knows, right? But I wouldn't put it past him.
I've watched that video so many times, I'd never noticed that. But it's an amazing video because he's there. His hair is slightly, he's playing with his hair. It's a bit out of place. He's got a little bit of the stutter. I was told by someone that they showed that for a long time. This was many years ago, 15 years ago. And I think it's in my MI6 book, that they used to show that to recruits at MI6, when they were being trained, just as an example of what of both an example of Philby and of someone who's kind of cool under pressure, to lie with the cameras rolling, and that, the film gets to the end and then there's just silence in the room as they all sit there and ponder this great betrayer of the British Secret Service. That's Philby.
Wonderful. Well, Gordon, thank you for coming on to Spybrary, making your debut appearance. We'd love to welcome you again. So sure, there's lots more books in you. And
thank you.
The Spy in the Archive is available in the UK as we go to air the episode. It is available in the United States from January next year, but you guys know how to get books from the UK. You're all good Spybrarians. If you can't wait till January, go get it. I'll also add links to the two Rest is Classified episodes where Gordon and David go a bit deeper into Mitrokhin's life. So thank you ever so much for coming on to Spybrary, Gordon.
A pleasure, Shane. Really nice to talk to you, and I'll definitely see you again.
That's it for this episode of Spybrary. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the spy in the archive and the extraordinary story of Vasili Mitrokhin. A huge thanks to Gordon Corera for joining us. This really is a podcast career highlight for me. I'm a huge fan of Gordon's work. And thank you, Gordon, for coming on and sharing your insights and more about this book. And do check out The Spy in the Archive. Highly recommend. And if you haven't already, for the 0.2% of you who listen to Spybrary who are not listening, I highly recommend his podcast, The Rest is Classified, which offers even more fascinating stories from the world of intelligence and espionage. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and share Spybrary with your fellow spy fans. It really helps the show grow, and it helps me recruit such quality guests as Gordon Corera to come on to Spybrary and share more about their work with us all. You can find links to the book, to Gordon's work, and more in the show notes at spybrary.com/Gordon. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep your eyes peeled and your ears open, and keep it Spybrary. This is Shane Whaley, signing out.
Thanks for listening to the Spybrary podcast. You don't have to wait for the next episode. Join the conversation happening now at facebook.com/Spybrary and on Twitter @Spybrary.